interesting guest, Mr. Troy Worden. And Troy is an individual that I would probably describe as one of the last of the Renaissance individuals. Now, he's only 24 years old. You were 24?
22.
22. Oh, my gosh. You made a liar out of me already. And the reason that he's on the show is because Troy, in his own right, has become sort of a household name in those who are fighting to preserve our freedoms, mostly on the college campuses. And I first became aware of Troy through the gracious auspices of my Vice President for Talent Acquisitions, Alex Madajian. And of course, Alex is now working with Troy in Washington, D.C. But I actually am the proud owner of an original Troy Worden article in the newspaper that he happens to be writing for right now, the Daily Signal. And so that's how we became friends on Facebook, and then Alex very kindly set up and arranged for you to be here today. I have to apologize. We're not in our regular studio that you're used to with all the beautiful stuff. We're kind of in an undisclosed location. Dick Cheney is in the bathroom right now. He'll be right out. And so we're doing this in sort of a homemade environment, which you probably can detect. So please bear with us. We'll be pausing every now and then for station identifications for the the stations that are along the Freedom Matters network. Anyway, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
Okay, let's start with your bio. You were born in?
I was born in Berkeley, California.
Oh, God, what a place to be born in. And how did you become president of the Berkeley College Republicans?
I had been involved in the Berkeley College Republicans for about a year previous to my becoming president. Mm-hmm. I've always been politically conservative, at least since high school. I have many fond memories of debating with my teachers throughout the entire class period while the rest of the students would watch. And we had a great time discussing politics in the pre-Trump era. I can't imagine what it would be like speaking to them in the Trump era.
And I bet you gave them a run for their money.
I think I earned their respect, and that's the most you can do with liberal.
You also work with campus reform, is that right?
I had the pleasure of working with Campus Reform from the Leadership Institute after the events on February 1st, 2017, the riots in Berkeley.
The riots at Berkeley. Of course, you've all heard of that. He's referring, of course, to the fact that as the president of the College Republicans at Berkeley, he had invited both Milo Yiannopoulos and Ben Shapiro, and there was a considerable pushback to the freedom of speech in both of those situations. Why don't you just give us the narrative?
Well, for instance, when I invited Milo Yiannopoulos in the fall of 2016, I did not expect the kind of reaction we received in the beginning of 2017. I think after President Trump had been elected, a lot of people were very angry, very hurt, and wanted to lash out, but they didn't want to do so intelligently. They decided to do so with violence. So I think the Milo Yiannopoulos event on February 1st of 2017 really was the starting point for the violence we would see across other college campuses, but also across the country. This was the excuse for the far left, especially Antifa, anti-fascists, so-called and self-described, to take to the streets to destroy private property and to attack conservatives.
Physically?
Yes, physically. And again, this harassment wasn't just physical, it also followed me to other places of employment that I worked at. It followed my girlfriend. And these people would send emails to our employers. They would go to our houses, luckily while we weren't there. They would follow us while we would be at rallies. They would attempt to engage us in fights and attack us at political rallies in Berkeley and Oakland. So these people are criminals. They're anarchists. I don't even think I'd bother calling them communists because that would imply that there would be some thought.
I call them communists. He's too polite to call them communists.
But I'd call them criminals and thugs.
Yes, we agree on that. They're criminals and thugs, yes.
So, and I think this is one of the biggest threats and the least talked about threats to free speech, to freedom in general in this country, because everyone knows that academia and the left, by and large, want to silence free speech, but they usually do so through legal mechanisms. Antifa is doing so through threats of violence and attempting to get conservatives fired at their places of employment. So this is really guerrilla warfare, and I don't think it's received adequate media attention. We are in the most prosperous and we would think civilized country in the history of mankind, and we still allow this kind of harassment to go on in the streets as if it's 1930s Germany.
Now, how do you think we got to the point where campus physical violence to shut down a speaker who was invited by a legitimate group, a student group, in this case the College Republicans at Berkeley? How did we get from where I remember that we used to go out and seek people who disagreed with the common thought and the paradigms that were existing? We used to go out and actually solicit them, and we were delighted when they showed up, and we were respectful, and we asked them questions, and they in turn enjoyed the experience. How did we go from 1972, when I was on the curriculum committee for the college where I was teaching, where we actively sought a diversity of intellect, a diversity of ideas, to this point that you confronted with in 2016 and 2017, where you're actually shut down, where you are told that you cannot bring this idea, this intellectual notion to the college campus. How do you think we got there? What's the linkage?
Let's take 1960s Berkeley during the free speech movement as the paradigm. That movement and the larger civil rights movement was based on non-violent protest.
Exactly.
Sit-ins, primarily, and the liberals, primarily, on Berkeley's campus and other college campuses, got what they wanted in terms of free speech because they put up a respectable front. Now, it might have been a tad revolutionary, but they did not resort largely to violence in order to make their point known.
Right.
So the Antifa, the anti-fascists of today, have failed to learn the lessons, not only of the civil rights movement, of the free speech movement in Berkeley in the 1960s, but also nonviolent protest movements throughout the last century, most notably Gandhi's protests in India, as well as Nelson Mandela's in South Africa. So I think a failure...
Which were very successful.
Yes, a failure to learn from history has caused the present violence. I would also like to add that the professors, the current generation of professors that are teaching students now, the generation that grew up in the 1960s, they failed to learn their own lessons. They failed to pass on the knowledge they gained through their civic activism. So again, we have a new crop of students, a new generation of students who are being told by their professors that the current president of the United States is a quote-unquote fascist, and therefore they must resist fascism by any means necessary. There is even an anti-fascist group that has harassed me and my girlfriend and my friends extensively. Their name is By Any Means Necessary. So these people actually believe, or they want us to believe, that they are fighting a new incarnation of fascism in the person of Donald Trump, and therefore they think that they are justified in taking up arms against us and abusing us in public.
Can we drill down a little bit on their line of thinking? And help me, because I don't really understand their line of thinking. As I see it, as I try to see it, first of all, we're dealing with a group of people who intellectually deny that there is any objective right and wrong. That's number one. But number two, they insist that their version of right is objectively the case. So there's a contradiction, logical contradiction right at the get-go, right out of the gate. They don't believe in objective morality, but they believe that because their morality and their notion of freedom is objectively the correct one, then therefore you or your guests don't have any right to speak. Have I got that right?
You have to understand intersectional feminism, neo-Marxism, the leftists of today, they do not follow their own fundamental precepts. They are not relativists. They have their own religion. They have their own Nicene Creed. They have their own irrational beliefs. Leftism today is actually a religion.
Yeah, that's interesting you said that they're not relativists. So are you saying to me, Troy, that they don't even recognize that they're involved in a contradiction, that they don't, but they don't believe in an objective morality, or do they? Am I wrong about that?
Well, this is a testament to their lack of intelligence. They actually believe that fundamentally there is right and wrong. They believe that tolerance of certain groups is the highest ethical stand you can take. So, for instance, when a quote-unquote conservative speaker says something against, say, transgender persons, gay persons, persons of what they consider to be disenfranchised minorities, they see that as a sin. Steve Cook, I believe his name is, recently gave a speech where he said that it is a sin not to prevent people from speaking on tech platforms who say things that are contrary to the morality of Silicon Valley.
So it's a sin not to shut those people down.
Yes.
That's a sin.
Yes. He says that there is a moral obligation, a religious obligation, to shut conservative speech down. And these people, I think, make it very clear. They are atheists who actually believe in a religion, a cult, except it's not a religion that worships a god. It's a religion that worships quote-unquote tolerance of certain groups. So even then, it's not equality. The French Revolution never produced people who care about equality for the sake of equality. It's actually a hierarchy. The real twist, however, is that the hierarchy is one that places the most disenfranchised peoples at the top and the most historically advantaged people at the bottom.
But where's the ground for this religion? I mean, all religions have certain grounding. There's always a grounding in a religion. And this fellow, Steve, what's his name?
Steve Cook, I believe, the current CEO of Apple.
CEO of Apple, okay. So he actually said that it is a religious sin not to shut these people down. Did anybody bother to ask him what is the foundation of this religion?
Absolutely not.
No.
It's not a thought through religion. It doesn't really even have its theology. It's primarily made up of a group of feminists. They're third-wave feminists. They call themselves intersectional feminists.
Can I stop you on that? Because
Certainly,
a lot of my view is, they're old geezers like I am. And we don't know what this intersectional thing is. Can you explain that for us?
Certainly. Intersectional feminism...
By the way, have some coffee.
Intersectional feminism holds a few basic beliefs.
Yeah. But the word intersectional, we keep seeing this in print and on media. So what does it come from?
Intersectional, I believe, refers to the idea that people have an identity that is a composite. So someone's identity is made up of different parts or components.
Oh, so it's all connected.
Yeah, so for instance, you can be a woman, but you can also be a woman of color. Well, nowadays, under the
That's news to me.
Under the
where do I sign up for that?
New liberal dispensation, you can be whatever you want to be.
Right. I heard about that.
As long as you're not a white Christian male.
No, I wouldn't think of that. No.
But
heterosexual, by the way.
Yes. Yeah. Returning to our initial point.
Yeah.
In other words, people have a certain level of oppression, you could say. If you're a woman, you're oppressed. If you're a woman of color, you're doubly oppressed.
And if you're a lesbian woman of color,
you're even more oppressed.
And if you're a lesbian woman of color Christian, wow.
Yeah, I mean, you don't get any brownie points under this theoretical framework. So what intersectional feminism does is it places the most quote-unquote oppressed persons at the very top of the hierarchy. These people are to be bowed to. These people are to be given all the special favors and honors that we can provide as a culture. And the oppressors are to be placed at the bottom. So I really think Nietzsche was incorrect. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, was incorrect in calling Christianity a slave morality. Christianity is fairly hierarchical. There are good people and there are bad people, and there is a level of between the two. There's a spectrum, so to speak. We also have angels, and then we have God. So Christianity is fairly hierarchical. This new liberalism that we have, I think, is an actual slave morality. If we want to talk about an inversion of values, intersectional feminism does not value hard work. It doesn't value someone's ethicality. It only values these incidental pieces of your character. such as whether you're born male or female, or lesbian or gay. In other words, things we don't have control over. So not only is this a kind of slave morality, to use a Nietzschean term, it's also not a meritocratic one either.
Yeah. I must advise our audience that Brother Troy is a very well read in Nietzschean philosophy. It's one of your favorite philosophers to read and interpret and to think about, right?
Certainly, but don't ever make the mistake of agreeing with everything every philosopher said.
No. We're going to take a very brief break to have our stations along the Freedom Matters network identify themselves, and we'll be right back after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, there we're back. To continue this narrative that you're giving us, great education that you're giving us about the new left. Do you call them the new left, or what do you refer to them as?
People call them progressives, they call them leftists, they call them neo-Marxists, they call them intersectional feminists. I would say all of these terms are of a kind. I think they're all getting at the same phenomena, which is really anti-intellectual, poorly educated, modern instantiation of the political left. I would say that the left of the French Revolution, the communists and socialists of old were far better read than the current generation of leftists. And so I think we've seen an intellectual decline in terms of the opponents of the right.
I call them Bolsheviks. That's my version. And yeah, I've been calling them Bolsheviks since 1967.
As long as you admit that it's in define your term, if you define your term accurately.
But it triggers them. It's really a good. They hate the word Bolshevik.
Well, they certainly. Keep in mind too, the new left is actually afraid to declare itself Marxist or communist, even though they might harbor sentiments. They actually don't have enough confidence, either intellectually or morally, to identify with that group. They would like to hide behind these other labels, these complex and convoluted labels like intersectional feminism.
Yeah. Now, it's popularly believed, I don't know if you've subscribed to this, but it's popularly believed in intellectual circles that the main culprit for this new left or progressives or liberalism is actually a school of philosophy that's called postmodernism. Do you subscribe to that? Do you subscribe that the root element, the root cause is academics teaching students and therefore teaching future teachers and therefore teaching future politicians, that the root of all of this is the intellectual stream that I'm not going to call it a philosophy because they don't believe in philosophy. Postmodernism. What is your thought on that?
I would say it is a symptom of postmodernism. Postmodernism, in the most general terms, is a belief that the fundamental questions of life and existence and meaning cannot be answered. Rather, it's all we can do is play a sort of game with language. So if you know writers such as Derrida and Foucault, we could broadly characterize them as postmodernists. Postmodernists, because they don't believe that there's really any serious answer to pressing moral questions or existential questions, they tend to fall back on a simplistic analysis of all phenomena or events in history or current social structures. So Foucault said every structure of society is about power. It's about establishing control over other people. So the structure of a classroom is meant to discipline the bodies of students, not to educate them.
Right.
And even knowledge itself is a form of power. So if you set the terms and define a field of knowledge, you are establishing power over certain groups, depending on how that knowledge is characterized. So these people have a very cynical, even nihilistic view of what education means, what culture means, what tradition means. And so I would think that all that I'm saying would accurately characterize the what you call the new left. I will say, however, that I think it's obvious that these people, because they adhere to this new religion, this cult of intersectional feminism, that they do have moral standards, even though they publicly proclaim themselves immoralists, or amoralists. They still do believe in right and wrong, and they believe in human dignity, the dignity of certain classes of people.
Yeah, I was about to ask you, what is the basis of their morality? I mean, there must be some basic precepts. All morality has to have a precept. in order to match this event or this person or this action or this behavior, to map that against the precept, to say, oh, well, that's wrong because it defies the precept. So what do you think the precept is for the New Left?
Well, their precept is based on their whims. It's based on fads.
So feelings?
Feelings. So for instance, a few decades ago, the quote-unquote gay rights movement was not really widely endorsed or held in the public conscience. It was primarily an elite intellectual belief.
Isn't it interesting that the word gay has been hijacked? Do you remember? Do you know how the word gay became synonymous and interchangeable everywhere and always in style sheets and in your business and media? Do you know how that happened?
Well, I'm sure you could educate me.
Well, it's in my book. I taught critical thinking and writing for 23 years, and in one of the chapters on language, I recount the story that in 1969, how appropriate, in New York City, there was a homosexual bar called, God, it's slipped out of my mind.
Stonewall?
Stonewall, thank you. Oh, you do know the story. Stonewall, and the police used to raid Stonewall and just beat up and drag homosexuals out, put them in paddy wagons, send them downtown, and charge them with misdemeanor things so that they could fill out their arrest sheets and they would look like they were good policemen. Well, in 1969, this is after the 1968 Democrat convention in Chicago, which went horribly wrong. The homosexual community, they decided they were going to fight back. So when the police came back to Stonewall on one particular night in January, I believe, they had table legs and clubs and baseball bats and bike locks and chains, and they beat the crap out of the police. And there was a riot. This is in Greenwich Village, by the way. So there was a riot by the homosexuals in that community, and the New York Times sent reporters down to cover the event. And so the reporter, would have his little yellow table like I have, and every time he would have to use the word homosexual, HOMOSEXUAL, right? So he asked one of the leaders, do you guys, like have a little short type of, inside name used just among yourself? And one of the leaders said, yeah, we call ourselves gay. Ooh, gay, that's wonderful. 3 letters. Oh my God, thank you so much. Because this is the days of typewriters,
Now it's LGBTQI.
Right, plus, minus. They keep
getting a little longer
again.
again.
Get a little longer, yeah. So we may have to find another word. But part of this, we're right and you're wrong of the left is that they have hijacked language. I mean, the word gay, if I said, if I told people that, we had a very gay lunch today, I said, gee, I didn't know that those 2 guys were homosexuals. It's almost erased. The original meaning of the word gay is carefree, lighthearted, fun-loving. That's the original meaning. But you cannot use that word in that original context without now the original meaning has been obliterated. It's gone.
Well, you see, they're also hypocrites in doing this. They believe that language doesn't have a set meaning. It can mean whatever they want, right. But I'm sure if you used gay in any other context, they would cry out and say that you would be demeaning someone who's homosexual, or you would be misusing the word. I don't think anyone uses the word gay in the archaic sense as being cheerful or happy.
Well, I always do, but I always get accused of being a homosexual. It's very strange. I don't know why. But here's another one. Even more, let's talk about the power to suppress freedom, because that's really what you're talking about now. You're drilling down on that. The power to suppress freedom by the left has gone so far as that they have forced every non-black person in at least America, I don't know about the globe, to refrain from using a certain word, and they have replaced that word with the N-word phrase. Now, any psychologist will tell you that when you say, I'm not going to use the N-word right now, everybody who just heard me fills in the real word. They all say the real word. So what are they accomplishing by forcing people to self-censor and not use the original word, but yet use this constructed mechanism to avoid saying the word? I mean, that's real power. If I can prevent you from using a word, I have just shut down your speech.
Well, you see, again, this is another aspect of the New Left considered as religion. In Protestant times, certain plays, even those written by Shakespeare, could not use the word God, at least in print. They would take out a letter, for instance. There are a lot of other oaths that you could not make because they involve invoking the Lord's name, and they would have to create shortening, I think they call them spoonerisms.
Yes.
And also other kinds of boulderizations were quite common in the Protestant era, and this was a result of Protestant censorship. So you see that really, at the end of the day, again, it doesn't make any sense to censor to these lengths when everyone knows what you're talking about. If you say something that everyone agrees is a euphemism for a certain thing, you really haven't lost any meaning whatsoever. You've just made it a little less offensive to the sensibilities of certain people.
Yeah, but you have enforced your power to make people self-censor. There's a case now at a local community college where a vice president was discussing the use of the N-word, and a student actually said, "Well, I was called and the student used the word, and the vice president actually repeated that word, and she said, "Well, I'm very sorry that somebody called you the," but she used the word. She's now being thrown out of the college. She's now being the student body and the Black Student Union is calling for her hanging, her lynching, her expulsion.
The same thing happened to the CEO of Papa John's. He was, I believe, discussing on a conference call with higher-ups in the company or with employees about a very similar situation. When someone is called a slur, he used some of those slurs. He did not self-censor, and he lost his job, and he had his image removed from all the promotional materials for the company.
Which he had started, by the way, I think, right?
Yes, well, you'll see that now we have something for a throwback to Roman times when they would chip off the faces of emperors, damnatio memoriam.
Yes, even back to Egyptian times.
Exactly. Yeah. So really, history does repeat itself, and it's being repeated because we still haven't learned that these practices are merely assertions of power. They actually don't have any real effects except to strike fear in people's hearts and further divide the country.
Well, we're going to take another break for our affiliate stations along the network to identify themselves, and we'll be right back. We're talking with Troy Worden, and Troy currently writes for the Daily Signal in Washington, D.C. I know he writes very well because he wrote a very fine article on my case of my dismissal at Santa Barbara City College. And anyway, we're going to be right back after a few seconds. 1, 2, 3, and we're back. All right, let's now go to about half of our show is gone, by the way. I can look at the clock. We're 27 minutes into the show, and we only have an hour. But I want to get from you, I'm going to really drill down now on what Troy Worden's precepts and concepts are about freedom. How do you understand human freedom?
Well, I think the Oxford professor, Isaiah Berlin, really fantastic essay describing two conceptions of freedom. So we have negative conceptions of freedom and positive conceptions of freedom. Negative conceptions of freedom would be, for instance, freedom from tyranny, freedom from oppression, freedom from being told what to do on a certain day. Positive freedoms are freedoms to do something. Right, so to go to the mall, to carry a gun, to speak your mind freely.
Right.
So I would think that historically freedom in the United States and in other liberal democracies has been defined negatively, right? So we are free from the federal government from intruding in our lives. That's what the Bill of Rights is fundamentally. It's telling us not what state governments can and can't do, but what the federal government can't do. It's not talking about what the federal government can do. Those powers are enumerated already in the rest of the Constitution.
It's interesting you say that because in looking at the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, you're absolutely correct. There are a series of positive and negative freedoms that are being spoken to. But I want to call attention to the Second Amendment because it has a very unique positivity to it. The right of the people shall not be abridged. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be abridged. This seems to me to be a rather affirmative, positive, talking about freedom and a protection of freedom in the Bill of Rights. whereas the first, fourth, fifth seem to follow. The third amendment is, you can't be forced to harbor a soldier in your house. Well, when's the last time that happened? So what do you think is the most important of the amendments that constitute the Bill of Rights? What's the most important one?
Well, the First Amendment, and primarily its guarantee of free speech. Mm-hmm. And I say this not because I believe that it's necessarily productive to be able to speak your mind all the time and say whatever you think all the time. Mm-hmm. As we know, there are times where it's better to keep silent and times where it's better to speak.
Pause for a minute here. What's going on here? I have to give consent. Sorry about that. A little technical interruption. We'll edit that out before we go on here. I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you just repeat the last 30 seconds of what you said?
Certainly.
Yeah.
I think the First Amendment, specifically the guarantee of the right to free speech, is the most important of the freedoms guaranteed in the Bill of Rights, because even though it's not necessarily preferable or beneficial for everyone to speak their mind all the time, the ability to speak your mind under pressure, to go against the grain, to go against the elites, to go against the masses, for the good, the common good, is a sacred right that has been cherished since the days of Athens. In Athens, they had a concept of free speech called perhesia.
Yes.
And the perhesiastes was one who spoke against the rest of the voting persons in the democracy under the threat of facing repercussions. So, for instance, they could be anathemized, they could be ostracized. Any number of things could happen to them if they spoke their mind, if they went against the majority in that situation. So I think we have to keep in mind that this concept of perhesia does exist in the Bill of Rights. Why else would the founders guarantee that right if they didn't believe that speaking freely was important for the common good, the good of the nation, the good of our posterity? So in other words, I don't think the founders wanted to protect necessarily hateful or flippant speech, although that speech is protected under the amendment. I think they actually wanted to, most of all, protect speech that was going against the majority, that was for the common good, saying things that need to be said when no one wants to hear them.
All right. Now, hard question.
Yes.
This is a hard question. Do you think that the Second Amendment was written to protect the First?
In the sense of the ability to bear arms and protect
Well, the
speech?
ability to overthrow it, as Thomas Jefferson called it, a sinful and tyrannical regime.
I do believe that is the case. The drafters of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence were influenced by John Locke, the political theorist from England, who said that it is the right of the people to overthrow an unjust government, a government that does not protect their right to property and the pursuit of happiness or property. So I do believe that that amendment serves that purpose. I think that was self-evident for anyone who studied the philosophy of the time, especially the political philosophy, and looks how the founders stress that continually throughout their writings.
Right. If you look at the decision, it's now called the Heller decision, which was the District of Columbia Supreme Court decision, where they actually, for the very first time in the history of the United States and the history of SCOTUS, they actually said that the word people in the Second Amendment refers to you as an individual, not you as a collective militia. Obviously, in order for you to join a militia, you have to be an individual, and that's how they reasoned it. You can't be a member of the individual unless you actually exist of a militia, unless you're an individual. Only 3 times in the whole Constitution does the document refer to the people, and that is one of them.
I did not know that.
Yeah, only 3 times. Another hard question. I wonder if we should take a break. No, we'll go. Do you think these rights that are enshrined and protected in the Bill of Rights are natural rights? If so, why so? And if not, why not?
Well, I think you have to understand the Lockean philosophy behind the conception of natural rights.
Right.
which essentially says that by virtue of your being an individual, you are endowed by your Creator with certain inalienable rights, and there are certain enumerated rights, like the pursuit of happiness,
Right.
that sort of thing. I don't know if that is necessarily the conception of natural rights we want to have philosophically. That might be what the kind of exposition we want to have in mind when we're interpreting the Constitution, because that's the philosophy that informed the drafters.
The writing of it, yeah.
Yes. But I think as a society, do we really want to ascribe a certain number of rights to individuals just because they're individuals? We have to really think about this. When you say someone has a right to be free, what do you mean? Freedom to do what?
Oh, freedom from what?
Freedom from what? It doesn't imply that there's a purpose behind that freedom. So what is an individual supposed to do? Decide whatever they want to do? There is a concept in philosophy called teleology, and many medieval philosophers had a conception of the human individual, the human being, as having a telos, a purpose.
A definite purpose.
A definite purpose.
Yes.
They didn't believe that an individual had a teleology that allowed them to choose their own purpose.
Right.
So in other words...
Which is what we do today.
Yes. So when we say the individual has a right to freedom, what we're really saying is the individual has the telos of having the ability to pick his own telos. In other words, it's kind of a non-definition. It's an open definition, and it doesn't really give us a guide to what we want to do, not only as individuals, but as a society.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because I know you've read existentialism. I know you've read Kierkegaard, for instance, and certainly I don't know if Nietzsche really qualifies as an existentialist, but you've read a lot of
Proto-existentialist.
Oh, thank you. I like that. I'm going to use that, right? But there's also a concept of law, which appears not in canon law, but it does appear in civil law, especially in the West, and that is the habeas corpus. I have the body. In other words, it's my first estate. The reason why the Enlightenment Fathers, I think, wove this notion that these rights that are enshrined in our Constitution and Bill of Rights is because we have an immediate first right to our own estate, and that first estate is our body. Hobbes talks about this. Thomas Hobbes, another British philosopher, right? It's all these philosophers creating these problems for us, right? But it's okay. He's a philosophy major. So, what do you think about that? I mean, what's your answer to the Hobbesians who say, well, wait a second. If the state breaks our contract, the social contract originated with Hobbes. If the state breaks up my contract, I'm going to give up some of my sovereignty, he says. I'm not going to stab you and rape your wife and take your car, and I'll refrain from doing those things, which I really want to do, by the way. I love that car of yours. Your wife, not so much, but the car I really like. If I give up doing that, you're going to protect me. You're going to give me roads, and you're going to give me an army. If somebody tries to kill us, you're going to defend us. You're going to do all these things. Now, what do you think when the state violates, in rebellare, he uses the Latin for in rebellare, when the state goes rogue, all right? When the state says, hey, you know what? We're under martial law now. The Constitution's been suspended. I'm in charge, and you're going to put you in prison, right? Doesn't that make sense? Isn't that a good argument for the natural law?
Certainly, but I think we also have to keep in mind that there are many cases where we don't have a right to do whatever we want with our body. So, for instance, suicide. We actively discourage suicide as a society. No one objects against that except probably the most radical libertarians. The issue of...
Well, I certainly object to that, by the way.
The issue of abortion is another case. You could use the concept of habeas corpus to say that I have a right over my body, including that of the unborn child within it.
Right.
So I do think that there are overriding concerns that extend just beyond being able to do anything, whatever one wants, with one's body.
Well, that's license, which is distinguished from freedom. I make a distinction between license and freedom. License is uninhibited action, whim, impulse, whatever comes into my brain, whatever I want, whatever passion or appetite I wish to resolve or appease, I can do that. That's license. I distinguish that from freedom. Because freedom to me is an intellectual understanding that I have a right to something, or I have a right to refrain from something. I have a responsibility. So how do you work that? I mean, for instance, let's take the example you just mentioned, which is suicide. Suicide is becoming a lot more accepted in Western society. In fact, the state of California has passed a suicide assistance bill, which is now law in the state of California. You can actually get doctors to help you to commit suicide. There are all sorts of problems, but I don't want to go into that. But I'm just talking about the right. Don't you think you have a right to kill yourself?
Well, it depends on how you view what human life means and what life in a society means. Mm-hmm. So,
but who should be the final arbiter of that question? Should it be you, or should it be the state, or should it be my lawyer, or my guardian, or my wife, or my husband, or what?
Well, in the past, the final arbiter was a shared religion in a community, a shared conception of the common good, as St. Thomas Aquinas would put it, and also as Neo-Thomist philosophers would put it, such as Alistair McIntire.
Yes.
They would say that whether or not a society prohibits or allows suicide, prohibits or allows abortion, prohibits or allows gay marriage, that would depend on the society's conception of the common good.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Aquinas, contrary to current Catholic teachings, even allowed for the killing of individuals convicted of grave crimes, such as heresy and murder, under the justification that killing that person, executing them through the state, would serve the common good, would prevent further damage to the rest of society. Mm-hmm. So we really have to ask ourselves when we approach difficult moral questions, not necessarily and always from this legalistic framework, which is a conception of rights, but also from a fundamentally moral one. Is allowing an action going to serve the common good, or is it going to go against it? But that means we have to have a shared understanding of what our society is and what it's trying to accomplish, toward what it's striving. And I don't think it's sufficient to say that we are a society striving toward freedom. You can't build an identity around freedom alone, because freedom is not something special to America. Freedom has existed in all good governments throughout history. Freedom is merely is merely a defining characteristic of a good government. That doesn't tell us anything about what it means to be American. It tells us what it means to have a good American government. It doesn't tell us what it means to be American. What are Americans trying to accomplish collectively together? We really need to, I think, answer that question. And once we answer that question, I think these legalistic concerns about rights language will fade away. I think that we should talk about rights. We should give them our utmost respect and credence when we're talking about legal situations. American law is organized around this conception of rights and what rights an individual has. But when we're talking about the morality, the ethicality of certain actions, we really need to reference the common good, and we need to work toward a shared understanding. Otherwise, American society is going to disintegrate. We will have no common values. Why did the Roman Empire fall? Why did the Austro-Hungarian Empire fall? The different groups inside the society had differing conceptions of the common good. So if we really want to learn from history, and if we want the American Republic to last far longer than just a few hundred years, we really have to come to a general agreement about where we're headed as a society. Otherwise, these concerns about rights will not mean anything in the long run.
We're going to take our last break. I'm speaking with Troy Worden. Troy is a very successful journalist, philosophy major, and former president of Berkeley College Republicans during the stormy years of 2016, 2018. I'm Mark McIntire. We're going to take a little short break here so stations along the way can identify themselves. We'll be right back. Stay with us. 1 and 2 and 3. Well, we're back, and we're wrapping up our engaging interview with Troy. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this and coming to this undisclosed location, not our regular studio. We're going to have you back in the regular studio at a certain time, and when our budget increases and we can afford you. But I want to reference something you just said at the turn of the break there, and that was freedom entails responsibilities. I think that
Absolutely.
is the message, and I get that. I got that. I want to drill down to something that's underneath that, and I want to reference Benjamin Franklin, who, as you know, was our ambassador to the Kingdom of France during the most difficult days of our Revolutionary War. And Ben he played chess with David Hume. He was a bon vivant. He had a lot of girlfriends. He ate a lot. He drank a lot of champagne. He had a great time. He was a good ambassador. He really enjoyed himself. But he was at a soiree, and his duchess, the duchess that was hosting him, she said, and this is in front of a lot of a whole room full of French aristocrats who had not the slightest conception of Enlightenment teachings and philosophies. And she said to Franklin, she said, "Mr. Franklin, what does it mean to be an American?" And he took a nice sip of champagne and he said, "What it means to be an American is to abide by a proposition." And Thomas Jefferson wrote that proposition, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I want to return to this connectivity between the notion of a Creator God that envisions and instantiates into the universe, infuses, if you will, into the universe, certain inalienable rights. The meaning of the word inalienable means you cannot get rid of them even if you wanted to. That's the real meaning of inalienable. I know when everybody takes the pledge, they go, "What does that really mean? What's that?" And they go look it up on Google. They go to the great God Google, and Google tells them some nonsense, but it doesn't really get down. Inalienable means I cannot separate myself from these rights. Therefore, where do they come from? Well, according to Thomas Jefferson and according to the writers of the Constitution, they come from the Creator. Agree or disagree?
Well, that's one conception of what it means to be a human individual. So in other words, I think what Jefferson was attempting to say was that by virtue of our being created by God, by virtue of our being human beings, we have certain rights that should be respected by human law. So in terms of natural law, we should be accorded these rights, the rights of conscience, the rights to pursue happiness. Most philosophers, Aristotle down to St. Thomas, agree that all human action is directed toward happiness. And therefore, I think Jefferson thought it would make perfect sense to say that the natural law, the definition of human nature, should be respected by a temporal authority like the United States government. So I think that's what he was attempting to say. Whether or not you believe that proposed interpretation of natural law and human nature is up for debate among philosophers, I think. But undoubtedly, that's what Jefferson meant by that phrase.
But Troy Worden, I want to know what Troy thinks. What does Troy? Forget about Jefferson. He's an old dead white guy. I want to know what you think about whether or not the rights that are enshrined in the Bill of Rights, whether they are invented by humans and that's it, or whether they come from something outside of humans, namely a Creator God.
Well, I think we might be, again, I think going back to our earlier discussion, we might be missing the point. Alasdair McIntire, who was a neo-Thomist philosopher.
No relation here.
No, but it's great minds seem to bear that last name.
Yeah, we have a respect for St. Thomas, but go ahead.
He said that Thomas would not have viewed abortion in terms of, say, a right to life. Now, that's a very convincing argument in our current milieu, right? If we frame it as a right, we frame it as inalienable, and then we frame it as a really grave injustice to deprive someone of that right. I think Thomas would have viewed, and Alasdair McIntire says Thomas viewed that would have viewed abortion differently, in the sense that depriving someone of their life would be going against God's law, and therefore would be an injustice in the sense that it would be a disobedience to God. So Thomas and a lot of medieval Catholic philosophers viewed these moral issues as really disobedience toward God, and they viewed man as his purpose, his telos, as being to serve God, to obey God, and they thought this was good, right, and proper. I think that is the discussion of man as a moral creature and what it means to be man is a more honest discussion to have than to talk just about rights. Again, I think Jefferson's words are useful in a legal framework because it is fundamentally a sort of a legalistic understanding of human nature that there are certain rights. But I think it's only half the picture. Right. I think when we talk about morality, we talk about not only rights, but we talk about fairness, we talk about obligation, justice. You mentioned earlier, justice. Right. Notice a lot of the Greek philosophers do not place tolerance or giving someone the proper rights at the top of their ethical framework. Right. They place justice at the very top. And their conception of justice was defined not only in terms of the individual, but in terms of the whole society.
Yeah, and that brings us full scale turn. That loops us right back to our original topic of conversation, which is the very people that disrupted your free speech and the free speech of your guests, Milo, Yiannopoulos, and Ben Shapiro. They believe that their concept of justice is the objectively right concept of justice.
And good for them.
Yeah,
good on them.
But they have no base. I mean, they don't offer you any evidence or principles. There's no principles and no evidence.
That's their problem. And so I would like to distinguish between the legal issue and the moral issue. So legally, they are not allowed to infringe upon our right on a public campus, which is subsidized by taxpayers to the federal government.
That's why they lost the cases.
It's why the University of California, Berkeley decided to settle the case, the free speech case we had against them over the Milo Yiannopoulos and Ben Shapiro. So again, I think it's unconstitutional for Antifa to shut down our speaking events and infringe on our right to free speech. Do I think they're morally justified? I would say that they are not morally justified because in a civil society, if we see certain kinds of speech that we view as reprehensible, we use other methods other than physical attacks and destruction of private property to deal with it. It's called shame. Shame and ostracism and anathemization were the way that people dealt with what they considered immoral people responsibly for hundreds and thousands of years. We decided as a society historically to make people outcasts, to not invite them to our events, to not invite them to share in our community, to disassociate ourselves from them. Right. I'm quite fine if these anti-fascists don't want to be my friend. I'm quite fine if they want to protest against me peacefully. I'm quite fine with them taking a moral stand on the issue. Good for them. But what I don't respect is the use of violence and the destruction of private property for no other reason other than the fact that they disagree with my point of view. If I were taking up arms against these people and actually doing grave and serious injury physically to certain groups, I think they would be justified in defending themselves. Self-defense is a universally recognized moral action. It's not prohibited by, say, even the Ten Commandments and many other ancient law codes. But I think they've misjudged the situation. So, for instance, they call me a fascist, they call me a Nazi, they call me every name under the sun. They use these words as slurs. They're not accurate designators of my beliefs and what I'm trying to do. I have not physically attempted to hurt anyone. I've simply tried to provide liberal students with a conservative point of view through, sometimes controversial speakers, sometimes uncontroversial speakers.
But do you suppose that shaming and ostracism have failed to work in the modern context?
No.
For the very simple reason.
Absolutely not.
Let me finish the question. Has failed in the modern context because it is popularly perceived now that I don't really care what you think about me. You can try to shame me all you want. You can not invite me to the mayor's Christmas party and cocktail. Thank you very much. I'd rather stay home and watch something on Netflix. I don't really care what you think about me. So don't you think that modern essayist perceptive, to be perceived, has been weighed? I mean, how many people now really existentially are afraid of what somebody else thinks of them?
It's human nature to care what other people
You really think so? Oh.
So, well, Mr. McIntire,
I guess I'm unnatural.
you might be very unnatural, but most people don't.
I'm very unnatural.
Most people would not like to have endless amounts of articles written about them, calling them.
If you're writing them, I don't mind if you write articles about them.
Well, I mean, journalists have a lot of power in this
they do.
country, and they have a lot of responsibility.
Mhm.
And people who engage on social media also have a lot of power and responsibility. There's been plenty of people who've been pushed to suicide based on bullying on social media. In other words, other people were shaming other people.
Mhm.
Obviously, that's going too far to bully people into suicide. That's I would say everyone agrees that's immoral and an abuse of the ability to shame.
Yeah.
But if you truly believe that me or someone else is morally reprehensible,
Mhm.
don't associate with me, and say what you believe about me, and say why you think I'm morally reprehensible. And at some point, if you convince enough people, if you persuade a majority of society that I am not a person to be associated with, I'm probably going to not be so loud and proud about my conservative beliefs. And that's sort of exactly what's happening.
But they don't stop at just shaming you. They don't even bother shaming you. They go on to violence. They go on to shutting your mouth.
Well, yes, and I'll give you two illustrative examples. When I was at U C Berkeley, right after the Milo Yiannopoulos event, I was approached by two people. In one instance, I was approached by an elderly woman, and I believe she came up to me and she told me I should be ashamed of myself.
Mhm.
And I said, I responded to her politely, you're entitled to that belief. And she walked away. She didn't harass me. She didn't physically assault me. Later on,
she was trying to shame you.
yes, and I think
That's
that was
fine, yeah.
she's perfectly
Sure,
and well
sure,
within
yeah.
the standards of public decorum to do that. But I had another student who politely approached me and told me he thinks that if it's okay to punch someone you think is a Nazi. Now I said it with a smile. He was very polite to me. I think he said he didn't think I was a Nazi, but he said that there are other people he thinks should be punched if he thinks they're a Nazi.
That's just the strangest thing in the world.
Well, and I'm not even I'm not talking about rights in this context. I'm not talking about habeas corpus. I'm not talking about the right to free speech. I'm talking about civil society.
Right.
A society cannot cohere if people are being attacked for the speech they say. It turns into anarchy.
Random punching people.
It turns into a bloodbath. And I've had friends who've been hospitalized and punched in the streets of Berkeley simply because they were conservative or people mistook them to be conservative, and the perpetrators are Antifa. The issue with Antifa is not so much it's not only a free speech issue, and it's not really an issue of shame. I'm all right with shame. It's the breakdown of civil society and public order, and we simply can't have that in a society such as America if we want to be taken seriously on the world stage, or else we're no better than a third world country where anarchy reigns.
Well, we're coming up to the end of our hour, believe it or not. I'm speaking with Troy Worden. And one final question. I have about a minute 30. I wanted to ask you, what is it that you want to do in this world? What is your legacy going to be that you actually lived on Earth during your time? What will be your legacy?
Well, I don't know yet. That's an ongoing question to figure out what I'm here for.
You're only 22. I know you don't think about this a lot.
But just given the last few years, if I were to give an account of my life to other people, I would say that during my time at Berkeley, I had hoped to make a new free speech movement. Not only a free speech movement for leftists like the one in the 1960s, but a free speech movement for conservatives as well. So what I like to call what happened over these past few years at Berkeley, I like to call it the new free speech movement.
The new Mario Savio.
Well, I wouldn't go so far as that.
I would go so far as to say that. I want to thank you so much for being with us. I certainly, we will be hearing from you, and more importantly, we will be hearing about you.
Well, thank you. Hopefully it's good things.
And thank you very much for joining our program today. I am Mark McIntire, and this is the Freedom Matters with Mark McIntire network, and we will be with you again. We drill down on the underlying principles of freedom, especially the freedoms enshrined in our Bill of Rights. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.